Today we're still in Exodus chapter 3, and it's lessons from Moses at the bush. It's Exodus chapter 3 verses 1-5. Now Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, and he led the flock to the far side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. There the angel of the Lord appeared to him in flames of fire from within a bush. Moses saw that though the bush was on fire, it did not burn up. So Moses thought, I will go over and see this strange sight, why the bush does not burn up. When the Lord saw that he had gone over to look, God called to him from within the bush, Moses, Moses. And he said, Here I am. Do not come any closer, God said. Take off your sandals, for the place where you're standing is holy ground. And so there we see that God spoke and used Moses. And so some of the lessons we can learn from the bush are this, that the power to accomplish what God wants us to do doesn't come from us, it comes from His power. 2 Corinthians 4 verse 7, we have this treasure in earthen vessels, so that the surpassing greatness of His power will be of God and not from ourselves. Let's remember that all we are empty vessels and clay pots. First of all, we notice the day. This was a day when God was going to break our 40-year silence. For 4 decades, Moses had been in Midian in the wilderness, and he was on the run, and we have no record of God speaking to Moses. When he does speak here in this passage, we see that God was preparing Moses for to be the deliverer, or the one that God was going to use to deliver his people from the slavery in Egypt. Then next we see the bush, verses 2 and 3, and it just seems to be just an ordinary scrub bush, or thorny bush, of which there are many in Midian. In fact, there are millions of them. First, we notice that he looked at the bush, and then he said something to himself. And it was at that very moment that Moses saw something which was particularly strange. And Swindle says, I don't believe he had the foggiest idea that God was in the bush. He was simply curious, as any of us would have been. Then we see the need, verse 4, God spoke to Moses. At the same moment he turned and looked. As far as Moses was concerned, a bush was speaking, but God had not introduced himself yet. And this is what, of course, would happen later on in the passage. Of course, God spoke, called his name twice, and Moses answers, I'm here, in Hebrew. 40 years before, he would have answered very differently. But now, after 40 years of obscurity and silence, his only response is quiet and reluctant, I'm here. And believe it or not, that's all God wanted to hear. And then Moses was told, the place you're standing on is holy ground. The word holy means separated. And God was saying to him, Moses, I want you to be separate from all that's happened in the past. Apparently God saw this moment as so holy and precious that he wanted nothing between Moses and himself. So the 3 takeaways from this passage, there are a lot more, but just focus on 3. We run before we're sent. Remember, Moses, whilst he was right to be wrong at the injustice, of course, it's never right to take a human life. And that, of course, leads to the fact that Pharaoh is after Moses, and then Moses has to flee. And sometimes we need to wait on God to set things up before we move out in service for Him. And this waiting upon God is perhaps one of the hardest things to do as a Christian, but it is very necessary for us to wait upon God to, as it were, set things up and for things to be in place in order for us to serve Him effectively. I think it's Psalm 27, that beautiful psalm which reminds us about David and his desire to know God. One thing I've desired of the Lord, that I may be hold the beauty of the Lord in the temple, and that is his one desire. But that particular psalm ends with a very interesting verse, Psalm 27 and verse 14. It says this: wait for the Lord, be strong and take heart, and wait for the Lord. And this reminds us that there is that need for us to wait upon God. Then the next one is we retreat after we failed. And this is what happened with Moses. He had failed, and he thought that he had messed it up, and he had, but God was able to use him after many years in the wilderness in Midian. And then the last thing is we resist when we are called. And of course, we see this later on in Exodus chapter 3. But Swindle says many who miss opportunities to flame brightly for Christ, like a radiant city shining on a hilltop. All God is waiting for you to say, and me to say, is, I'm here, Lord, I'm yours, thorns and all, just set me afire. Interesting that God used a burning bush to show Moses the holiness of God, and also that he had to be set on fire of God to serve him. Thank you for listening.